Tonight, we travel to the heart of ancient Greece, where mist drifts through mountains of marble and time, and the air hums with unseen voices. In the folds of Mount Parnassus, there once stood a place where mortals sought the words of gods, a sanctuary where fate itself was whispered in riddles. It was called Delphi, a city of sunlight and shadow, where the god Apollo was said to speak through a mortal priestess. Kings and wanderers alike came to listen, hoping to learn what the threads of destiny held for them. Beneath its shining columns and sacred laurel trees, prophecy flowed like a river, mysterious, powerful, and never quite understood. In the hush of ancient halls, the oracle spoke. Her words carried on smoke and breath, half dream, half truth. To stand before her was to feel the weight of eternity, to hear time itself pause in reverence. For those who came to Delphi, answers were never given plainly, only glimpsed, like stars behind a veil of fog. So, settle in, and let us journey together through that sacred silence. Let the mountains, the murmurs, and the golden light of Apollo guide you through the mists of time. And if you enjoy quiet travels through forgotten worlds, consider subscribing, so you'll never miss the next whisper from history. Long before temples crowned the slopes of Mount Parnassus, before marble columns reached toward the sun, the mountain was a place of silence. Wind drifted through wild thyme and laurel, carrying whispers older than prayer. The earth itself seemed to breathe, slow, patient, eternal, waiting for the voice that would one day speak through its heart. In those forgotten ages, Delphi was not a sanctuary, but a wound in the world, a fissure where life and death brushed against one another. From that chasm rose vapors, strange and shimmering, said to hold the dreams of the earth. Shepherds who wandered too close would fall into trances, their eyes turned to horizons unseen. They spoke of visions, of fire, of gods, of cities yet unborn, and when they awoke, they remembered nothing, only the echo of voices that were not their own. The people feared this place and called it holy. They built no walls, no altars, for they knew the mountain did not belong to them. It belonged to something deeper, to the serpent who coiled beneath the soil, guardian of the earth's first breath. They named the serpent Python, ancient child of Gaia. Its body stretched through caverns and roots, and its eyes were said to mirror the birth of stars. It guarded the spring where the vapors rose, the very pulse of the world's beginning. No man dared disturb it, for Python was prophecy itself, the breathing memory of the planet. But one day, the god Apollo descended from the heavens, shining with unyielding light. He carried his silver bow and a quiver filled with arrows of flame. The serpent stirred, the earth shuddered, and day met night in a clash that echoed through eternity. When the god's final arrow struck, the serpent's cry rolled through the valleys like thunder made of grief. In the silence that followed, Apollo stood over the fallen guardian. The spring still murmured, but the air was different, sweeter, warmer, touched by the divine. The god bent down and claimed the place as his own, naming it the navel of the world, the omphalos, where all things begin and end. Yet the serpent's essence did not vanish. It seeped into the soil, curling through cracks and stones, whispering beneath the surface. Some said the god's victory was never complete, that even in death, Python's breath remained, mingling with the god's light, creating a harmony of shadow and flame. And so Delphi was born, a place of dual spirits, of life and decay, of divine reason and primal chaos. The people came again, cautiously at first, to feel the mountain's warmth, to breathe its strange air. Those who lingered too long spoke words not their own, eyes glassy, hands trembling with unseen power. They believed the god had chosen them to speak. Priests gathered, building a small altar of rough stone above the spring. They sang to Apollo and burned laurel leaves, the scent rising like gold into the mountain's lungs. In time, a temple of marble would rise here, but the mountain was already alive, its voice waiting for a vessel. It was then that the first woman heard the call. She was young, pure of spirit, and unafraid of the vapors that others fled. They say she sat beside the spring and closed her eyes, her breath merging with the earth's. When she spoke, her words were not her own. They came in broken rhythm, like wind through branches, like memory through sleep. The priests listened, awestruck. The god had spoken, not in thunder or fire, but in the trembling voice of a mortal. From that moment, Delphi changed forever. The place that had been feared became the most sacred ground in Greece. Apollo's temple grew around her voice. Each stone was laid with devotion, each prayer an echo of the god's music. Pilgrims began to arrive, carrying offerings of honey and gold, hoping to hear even a single word from the breath of the divine. But the mountain never forgot the serpent. Deep beneath the marble, the old power coiled, silent but not gone. The air that rose through the fissures was sweet, yet strange, a mingling of god and ghost. The oracle's voice would always carry both, the warmth of Apollo's light and the chill of something far older. So Delphi became a place of balance. The mountain breathed between worlds, holding its secrets beneath stone and song. The woman who spoke, the priests who listened, the pilgrims who wept, all were part of the same great dream. And when night came, and the fires burned low, the mountain exhaled once more, a breath that rose to the stars, carrying the sound of the first prophecy. A whisper born of light and shadow, of serpent and god, of silence remembering speech. As centuries drifted like clouds across the mountain, Delphi changed, not in spirit, but in form. What had once been a wild fissure in the earth grew into a sanctuary of marble and devotion. The voices that once rose from the ground now echoed through columns of stone, through courtyards perfumed with incense, through the soft prayers of those who sought the unseen. The people came to call this place the center of the world. They believed the gods had chosen Delphi as their meeting point, where heaven leaned down to kiss the mortal plane. In the temple's heart stood the omphalos, the sacred stone that marked creation's pulse. Smooth and white as bone, it was wrapped in a net of carved serpents, a memory of the power that once slept beneath. Every wall shimmered with stories. Carvings of Apollo's triumph, of the slaying of the serpent, of light conquering shadow. Yet the wise whispered that the serpent was not destroyed, only transformed, that its spirit still curled through the temple's veins, guiding the whispers of prophecy from below. The priests who tended the temple lived between reverence and fear. They knew that the god's gift was also a burden. For the oracle's voice was not pure sunlight. It was twilight, that fragile space where divine and mortal breath mingle. Too much of it, and one could lose their way, so they built rituals of balance. Before any prophecy, the air was cleansed with laurel and smoke. The Pythia fasted for days, bathing in the cold spring that ran from the mountain's heart. Purity was not just a rule, but a protection, a shield against the current of divine madness. When the moment came, the chamber beneath the temple filled with fragrance of burning herbs, of myrrh, of damp stone. The priestess descended alone, barefoot, holding a sprig of laurel in trembling fingers. Around her, the air shimmered with invisible motion. The fissure still breathed. From its depths rose the sacred vapors, the mingled breath of Apollo and the ancient serpent. The Pythia knelt, inhaled, and the world seemed to slow. Her body stilled, then shivered, as if her spirit had stepped beyond its shell. Those above could hear her voice rising, low and broken at first, then weaving into rhythm, half song, half riddle. Her words made little sense to mortal ears, yet the priests listened with devotion, translating each phrase into meaning. In that translation, empires were born, wars were halted, and hearts were shattered. It was said that when the oracle spoke, time itself listened. Even the wind seemed to pause between her breaths. To ask her a question was to risk the truth, for Apollo answered only with what the soul already feared to know. Outside the temple, pilgrims waited in silence. Some carried offerings of gold, others only faith. Kings sent messengers, trembling like children. A single word from the mountain could decide the fate of a nation. Yet the oracle's answers were never simple. They were mirrors reflecting both hope and doom. Through the centuries, Delphi's fame grew brighter than any crown. Travelers from distant lands, Egypt, Persia, even beyond the Aegean, came to see the place where the gods spoke through mortal breath. They walked the sacred path, lined with statues and offerings, each step a prayer whispered to eternity. But beneath all the glory, the mountain remained unchanged. The same wind that had whispered through time before the first stone was laid still wandered through its peaks. The same spring still murmured its ancient song beneath the temple floor. The serpent's dream, perhaps, had never truly ended. At night, when the fires burned low and the priests fell silent, some claimed they could hear a second voice beneath the oracles, deep, ancient, and sorrowful, like the echo of something forgotten yet awake. It spoke not in words, but in feeling, the ache of time itself remembering its first breath. Thus, Delphi lived between two worlds, one of marble and offering, the other of shadow and pulse. The oracle's voice was the bridge, carrying light into darkness and returning with secrets wrapped in smoke. And though centuries would come and fade, the mountain's breath continued, gentle and endless. The god's fire still flickered in mortal lungs, and the serpent's sigh still curled beneath the stones. In that mingling, the mystery endured, unbroken, eternal, divine. Time is patient on the slopes of Delphi. Seasons turned like slow prayers, and each one left its trace upon the stones. What began as a whisper between the mountain and the gods became a language that shaped empires. Yet, beneath the hymns and incense, the truth of the oracle's beginning still lingered in silence, an origin not fully told, not fully understood. Long before Apollo claimed the place, long before marble caught the morning light, there were those who listened to the earth. They were women of the mountain, nameless, barefoot, and wise. They watched the mists rise and saw messages written in their shape. They spoke to trees, to rocks, to the running water that seemed to answer back. To them, prophecy was not divine. It was natural, as much a part of the world as thunder or dawn. When the men of cities came, bringing their gods and their reason, the old ways trembled. They built temples to order what once flowed wild. They named the voices they heard. They called one Apollo, another Gaia, another Themis, as though naming would grant understanding. But the mountain did not change. It only learned new languages. Apollo's temple rose where the serpent once lay, his music forever binding the wild to the divine. The oracle, born of earth, now spoke for heaven. And in that fusion, Delphi became something greater, a meeting of all opposites, fire and soil, reason and madness, man and God. The oracle's words began to shape destinies far beyond the valley. When the Spartans sought wisdom before war, when kings debated the conquest of Persia, when philosophers wrestled with truth, all came to Delphi, carrying questions like offerings. And always the answers returned like riddles. Know thyself. Nothing in excess. The greatest wisdom is humility. Yet, even these words carved in stone, recited by generations, were born from silence. The Pythia did not speak from reason, nor from learning, but from surrender. She allowed the god to move through her like wind through reeds. Her words, though divine, carried traces of the human heart, fear, longing, wonder. Perhaps that is why they endured, because they were not perfect but alive. Scholars later would search for explanations. They would say the vapors beneath the temple came from gases rising through the rock. Ethylene. They guessed that the Pythia's trance was no miracle but chemistry. Yet even if that were true, it would not lessen the mystery. For the question would remain, why here? Why this mountain, this fissure, this voice? The ancients believed that certain places were thin, where the boundary between worlds grew fragile, like silk ready to tear. Delphi was such a place, a threshold, a wound in the earth that bled truth instead of blood. To step there was to risk being seen not only by gods, but by one's own soul. Over time, the rituals deepened. Pilgrims were purified, priests sang hymns at dawn, and offerings of honey and gold filled the treasuries. But beneath all the grandeur, the heart of Delphi was still a whisper. The oracle still sat alone in the dark, inhaling the breath of the mountain, surrendering her voice to the unseen. There were nights when thunder rolled over Parnassus, and lightning illuminated the temple like a lantern of the gods. The priests would fall to their knees, for they believed Apollo himself had returned, his chariot streaking across the sky. In those moments, Delphi felt alive, as if every stone pulsed with the heartbeat of creation, and when morning came, the valley would be quiet again. The smoke of offerings drifted over olive groves. The river murmured its endless hymn, and somewhere deep below, the serpent slept, dreaming of the first days when the world was young and the air still remembered its divine weight. In the end, the story of Delphi's origins is not about gods or gas, not even about prophecy. It is about the endless human hunger to listen, to lean close to the mystery of existence and ask, "What am I meant to know?" The oracle was not only Apollo's voice, she was humanity's echo. For every answer she gave, she awakened 1,000 more questions. Every truth revealed became another veil, and perhaps that was her greatest gift, not to end the search, but to remind us that some truths are meant to be lived, not spoken, so the mountain still breathes. The wind still carries the scent of laurel and stone, and though the temple has fallen, though the god's voice is silent, the listening remains. Somewhere in that quiet, in every question whispered to the night, Delphi still speaks. Morning rose gently over Delphi, its light slow and golden, climbing the slopes like a blessing. The air trembled with the scent of laurel and smoke. Far below, the valley still dreamed, veiled in silver mist, but atop the sacred hill, movement stirred, quiet, deliberate, reverent. The day of prophecy had come again. Within the heart of the temple, behind pillars that caught the first rays of dawn, the priestess waited. She was not born to this life. She had been chosen. The elders said Apollo himself selected her, though his voice spoke only in silence. Some believed it was her eyes, calm as still water, yet holding the weight of unseen worlds that had marked her for the god. Her name was lost to time. They called her Pythia as they did all who came before. Yet beneath the title, she remained human, a daughter, perhaps once a lover, now a vessel. Her breath belonged not to herself, but to the divine wind that moved through her. She lived in purity and ritual, bound by the sacred law of the temple. No wine touched her lips. No touch of man crossed her days. Her existence was both holy and alone. As she walked barefoot across the marble floor, her steps echoed softly. The priests awaited her arrival, their chants rising in waves, carrying the ancient hymns that called Apollo from his realm of light. They burned laurel leaves and barley, cast honey upon the flame, and bowed as she passed, not in worship of her, but of what would soon speak through her. Beneath the temple lay the Aditon, the hidden chamber, the navel of the world. There the earth opened like a wound, exhaling a sweet and heavy breath. The air shimmered, thick with unseen power. It was said that in that breath lived the god's voice, and the priestess would inhale it until her own voice dissolved into his. She descended slowly, her white robes brushing the stone steps. The flicker of torches painted her face in gold and shadow. She paused at the threshold as though listening, perhaps to the faint hum of the earth, perhaps to her own heartbeat. Then she crossed into the dark. The priests followed, carrying bowls of spring water from Castalia. They poured it upon the floor, whispering invocations. The steam rose like spirits, winding around the columns before vanishing into the ceiling's dim light. Outside, pilgrims gathered, kings, generals, wanderers, all waiting for the god's reply. They had traveled from lands far and wide, bearing offerings of gold, of doves, of fear. Within the chamber, the priestess knelt before the fissure. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the gravity of what was to come. The laurel wreath upon her head rustled as though touched by unseen fingers. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, once, twice, then again. The vapors filled her lungs, the warmth rose through her, and her body began to sway. At first her voice came in murmurs, soft and broken. Then it grew foreign, melodic, like a song remembered from another life. The priests watched in silence. To them, this was the moment when the humans ceased and the divine began. Outside, the wind shifted. The temple bells rang without hands. A flock of birds took flight from the cliffs, their wings scattering sunlight in 1,000 fragments. The world seemed to hold its breath. Within that stillness, the voice of Apollo spoke. What the pilgrims heard was never clear. To one, it was a warning. To another, a blessing. To many, it was a riddle. But all felt the same tremor, the sense that they had touched something vast, older than memory, and yet alive within them still. And when it was done, when the voice faded, and the priestess collapsed into quiet, the priests carried her back to her chamber. They wiped her brow, offered water, and let her rest. She would awaken hours later, unaware of what she had spoken. The god's words did not belong to her. They passed through her like wind through a hollow reed. At sunset, she would walk again through the temple courtyard, her eyes soft, distant. Children of the priests would bow as she passed. Travelers would whisper blessings, but she would not meet their gaze. For though she lived among them, part of her still lingered below, in the breath of the mountain, in the space where Apollo's shadow touched the earth. Night came. The stars gathered above Parnassus, shining like watchful eyes. The valley below glowed faintly in the moonlight. The oracle slept, her dreams filled with rivers of light, with voices speaking in languages no mortal had ever known. Somewhere in those dreams, the god still whispered, not in thunder, but in stillness. Days passed differently for the Pythia. Time in Delphi did not move in straight lines, but in circles. Sunrise to ritual, ritual to silence, silence to sleep. The temple's rhythm became her heartbeat, and her life folded into its breath like incense curling into air. Each dawn she washed in the sacred Castalian spring, where the water ran cold and bright, said to cleanse the spirit of dreams and doubt. The path to the spring wound through olive groves where the wind never ceased its whispering. Travelers who saw her there often knelt in reverence, not out of command but instinct. She was the thread between worlds, human in shape, divine in purpose. And yet, when she cupped the water in her hands, her reflection looked back at her with quiet sorrow. She wondered, sometimes, who she might have been had she not been chosen. Would she have walked among the markets below, laughing with the scent of bread and wine around her? Would she have married, borne children, grown old beneath the same sun that now sanctified her solitude? But these were only passing shadows, the kind a soul releases when it remembers it has been claimed by something greater. When she returned to the temple, the priests greeted her in silence. They moved like echoes of an older world, their faces carved by years of devotion, their voices low, steady as the beating of distant drums. Together, they prepared for the next audience, for the next descent into the Aditon, where the breath of Apollo waited. Pilgrims came with stories that stretched across continents. Some arrived in grandeur with banners and gold, others came barefoot, their offerings wrapped in cloth. Each brought the same fragile thing, a question. And each left with a burden heavier or lighter than before, depending on how the god had spoken. The Pythia listened, though not as humans listen. She felt the questions before she heard them, the tremor in the voice, the weight in the air, the way the body carried its fear. Sometimes she pitied them. They came seeking certainty, but the god spoke in riddles. And she knew, deep within, that clarity was rarely a gift. It was the silence between the words that held the truest wisdom. When the hour came again, she sat upon the golden tripod. The laurel smoke drifted upward, veiling her face in silver haze. The floor beneath her breathed, a faint hum, like the pulse of the mountain itself. The air thickened, sweet and dizzying, and once more she opened herself to the unseen. Her body trembled. Her lips parted, and the god's voice poured through her. It came not in words, but in tones, rising and falling like waves, ancient and impossible. The priests bent closer, their styluses ready to carve meaning from sound. And outside, in the courtyard, a general from Corinth knelt, awaiting his fate. When the trance broke, silence fell like ash. The priests exchanged glances, unsure whether what they had heard was warning or promise. The general was called forth, his hands shaking as he received the message. The oracle had spoken. You will cross a great river, and a mighty empire shall fall. He left that day believing in triumph. Yet years later, when his own kingdom crumbled, the words would echo again, clear, cruel, and true. For that was the nature of the oracle's gift, to show men not what they wished to see, but what the gods required them to know. The Pythia, meanwhile, slept. Her dreams were full of shifting faces, kings, mothers, strangers she would never meet, all passing like clouds across the sky of her mind. In those dreams, Apollo stood beside her, radiant and still, his gaze like sunlight upon water. "You are my voice," he said, "but do not mistake the echo for the song." When she awoke, tears clung to her lashes. She could not recall why she wept. The morning had returned, and with it, her duties. Yet something inside her felt altered, as though each prophecy took a small piece of her and replaced it with light. Or perhaps it was emptiness. She could no longer tell the difference. Outside, the temple bells marked the passing of another day. The valley shimmered in heat. Pilgrims departed, their footsteps fading into the horizon. And on the mountain, the Pythia sat alone, her hands resting upon the laurel leaves in her lap, her gaze lost somewhere between heaven and stone. The priests said she was blessed. But sometimes, in the long hush of twilight, she thought of herself as a shadow, a flicker caught between two eternities. And still, she returned to the chamber when called, each time surrendering herself to the same unanswerable silence. For the oracle was not only a gift, it was a devotion without end. As the years drifted like mist across the mountain, the Pythia grew older, though time touched her gently. The temple's marble still gleamed white in the sun, the hymns still echoed at dawn, and the sacred spring still flowed, cool and eternal. But within her, something had begun to change, a soft fading, like the dying embers of a fire that had burned too long. She had spoken countless prophecies, each one carrying the breath of gods through mortal lungs. Some she remembered only in fragments, a cry, a vision of smoke, a single word repeated like a heartbeat. Others vanished completely, leaving her hollow and light-headed, as though the divine had borrowed her body and forgotten to return it whole. The priests said it was the price of divine communion, that the god's voice could not dwell in flesh without leaving its mark. Yet sometimes, when she looked into the water of the Castalian spring, she no longer recognized her reflection. The face staring back seemed distant, luminous, almost translucent, as though part of her already belonged to another realm still she served. Through summers heavy with dust and winters that froze the olive leaves silver, she descended into the Aditon, inhaled the breath of the earth, and let the words come. The pilgrims never ceased. They came with questions of love, of power, of destiny. They came to know the will of gods, though few realized they were truly asking about themselves. Some came trembling, fearing the answer. Others came proud, demanding to hear what would confirm their glory. To all, she gave the same truth disguised in riddles, that every fate begins within. The god's voice was only a mirror. One autumn evening, as the sun bled gold over Parnassus, she felt the mountains stir differently. The air trembled with a deep and ancient hum. The fissure below her feet exhaled a warm breath, carrying with it the scent of resin and stone. For a moment, she thought she heard music, faint, distant, as if Apollo himself played the lyre somewhere beyond the clouds. She closed her eyes and let the sound fill her. No priest stood near, no pilgrims waited. It was only her and the god, or perhaps her and the silence that pretended to be him. Her body began to sway gently, her lips parting without command. But no words came this time, only breath, only the smallest whisper, "I am still here." She did not know whether the voice belonged to her or the god. Perhaps, after so many years, they had become the same. In that instant, she understood what prophecy truly was, not the seeing of the future, but the listening to the eternal now. The god had never left her. He had been waiting for her to be still enough to hear. Outside, the last light faded. The priests would later find her seated before the chasm, serene, her eyes half open as though watching something invisible. They would say she had entered the final trance, that Apollo had called her home. But the truth was gentler. She had simply surrendered to the same breath that once gave her voice. They buried her with laurel leaves and honey, as the tradition commanded. Pilgrims wept, believing the oracle gone forever. Yet when the wind passed through the ruins that night, it carried a faint echo, a voice, or perhaps only a memory, whispering softly through the stones. Centuries would pass. Empires would rise and fall. The temple would crumble, and the language of her prophecies would fade into dust. But the legend of the Pythia endured. Artists painted her eyes half-closed in divine reverie. Poets wrote of her voice, the trembling bridge between heaven and man. Scholars debated her mysteries, searching for science in what was once sacred. Yet none could truly capture her. For she was not a woman, nor a priestess, nor even a myth. She was a silence given form, a reminder that somewhere between the breath and the word lies the mystery of existence. And even now, when the winds sweep through Delphi's empty stones, they seem to carry that same breath, soft, fragrant, ancient. Perhaps it is only the mountain sighing, or perhaps it is the lingering voice of the god, remembering the woman who once gave him speech. If you listen closely, you might hear it too, not as a sound, but as a stillness that fills the heart, the voice of Apollo, echoing not through marble or air, but through time itself. Night had fallen over Delphi, and the valley lay silent beneath the stars. The temple glowed faintly in the moonlight, its marble softened by shadow, its columns breathing the cool air of the mountains. Somewhere in that stillness, the world waited, as it had always waited, for the voice that once spoke between heaven and earth. Long before oracles spoke, before men learned to name their gods, the world itself was a mouth through which the divine whispered. The wind carried omens, rivers murmured truths, fire revealed what eyes could not see. The ancients did not ask for words, they listened for meaning in the rhythm of the earth. But humanity, restless and uncertain, longed for a voice they could understand. And so, across lands and ages, they built altars, temples, and shrines, each one a question carved in stone. They waited for a reply. Some heard nothing. Others only silence. But in Delphi, upon the navel of the world, something answered. It was said that the voice of the gods first came not as sound, but as trembling. The earth itself quivered beneath Parnassus, and from the fissure rose a breath, unseen, sweet, heavy with something the air had never known. Shepherds who wandered too near were struck by visions, by dreams that bled into waking. They spoke in tongues not their own, their eyes wide with light. Word spread through the valleys that the mountain was alive, that the gods had chosen this place to speak. When Apollo came, the trembling ceased, and the voice found order. It no longer roamed wild through wind and vapor. It entered a chosen vessel, shaped by ritual and faith. Thus, the oracle was born, the bridge through which the divine might speak in human sound. Yet even as Apollo's name was praised, some whispered that the voice was older than he, older than Olympus, older than the memory of men. The priests taught that it was his music that shaped the future, that his light revealed what was hidden. But the elders of the hills still remembered another truth, that the earth had always spoken, long before gods took form. The voice itself was never constant. To some, it came as melody. To others as frenzy. It spoke in riddles and visions, in fire and wind. No two heard the same thing, and yet all swore it was divine. The priests said this was because the god spoke to each soul in its own language, not of words, but of recognition. The prophecy was not given, it was remembered. On the mornings when the oracle prepared to speak, the temple trembled with quiet expectation. The pilgrims gathered like shadows at the base of the steps, their hearts beating in time with the slow pulse of drums. They waited for the scent of laurel to rise, for the god's breath to fill the chamber. And when it came, it was as though the world itself leaned closer to listen. The Pythia's voice, fragile, trembling, alive, became something beyond human measure. Her words spilled like water over marble, breaking and reforming into riddles that shone with divine logic. The priests wrote them carefully, their hands shaking. Kings bowed, generals wept, for they believed in that moment that heaven itself had bent to speak their names. But to those who stood far from the temple, the shepherds, the wanderers, the poets, it was not the words that mattered. It was the stillness that followed them, the echo that lingered in the air like the afterglow of a song. They said that was where the god truly lived, not in speech, but in silence, for the divine did not speak to be understood. It spoke to remind the world of its mystery. And so, Delphi became the mouth of eternity, a place where language was not simply heard but felt. The mountains carried the echo, the olive trees whispered it in their leaves, and the stones remembered it even when the temple fell quiet. The voice of the gods had entered the world, and the world would never again be silent. But even among the faithful, a question grew, one too dangerous to ask aloud. Was it truly the gods who spoke through the oracle, or had humanity, yearning so deeply for the divine, created the voice themselves? The priests silenced such thoughts with prayer. Yet beneath the hymns, the question remained, humming like a secret beneath the stone. Morning light crept gently across the temple's marble floor, warming the chill that lingered from the night. The priests moved in silence, sweeping the incense ash from the altar, preparing once more for the sacred ritual. Above them, the columns glowed like pale fire, and the air seemed alive with anticipation. It was the day the god would speak again. The Pythia walked slowly toward the Aditon, her bare feet whispering against stone. She carried no crown, no jewels, only the laurel in her hair and the stillness of one who had learned to listen beyond sound. Around her, the temple stirred like a living being. The air trembled with energy, faint but unmistakable, as though the mountain itself had drawn breath. Outside, the pilgrims waited, their offerings laid carefully at the temple steps. Bowls of honey, bronze mirrors, coiled garlands of flowers already fading in the heat. Each offering was a plea disguised as devotion, each prayer a hope that the gods might notice the fragile lives that flickered below them. Inside, the Pythia descended once more into the sacred chamber. The air thickened as she entered, rich with the scent of earth and laurel. Beneath her, the fissure exhaled its eternal breath, carrying a warmth that made the torches waver. She closed her eyes and began to hum softly, an ancient tune without words. One passed through countless voices before her, like a memory that refused to fade. The priests circled above, chanting in rhythm, their tones rising and falling like the sea. As their voices grew, the Pythia's body began to sway. Her breathing deepened, her pulse slowed. The world around her blurred into shadow and light, and in that stillness, something vast awakened. The voice came not as thunder, but as music, a low hum that seemed to rise from the bones of the earth. It moved through her, gentle at first, then fierce, like wind through a hollow reed. Her lips parted, and the words began to flow, strange syllables, layered with meaning too large for a single tongue. The priests leaned closer, their hearts pounding. The god was speaking. To the listeners above, it was not merely sound, it was revelation. The Pythia's voice carried a rhythm that resonated in the chest, as though the words themselves had weight. They felt it before they understood it, and perhaps that was the true intention. The divine, after all, was never meant to be reasoned with, only received. Her prophecy that day was brief but terrible. A shadow will fall upon the shining city. The river will carry the ashes of kings. The words left her mouth like sparks from a dying flame, and when the echo faded, only the sound of her breathing remained. The priests wrote it down quickly, though none dared to interpret it. They would deliver it to the city's envoy waiting outside, who would tremble upon hearing it and return home haunted by what it might mean. That was how the gods spoke, in fragments, in symbols, leaving mortals to weave the thread of meaning themselves. When the trance passed, the Pythia collapsed, her hands pressed to the cold floor. The priests rushed to her side, offering water, whispering blessings, their eyes wide with reverence and fear. For though they served the temple, even they never grew accustomed to witnessing the moment when human and divine met, that fragile edge where flesh became voice. Later, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, she sat alone in the courtyard, watching shadows lengthen over the stones. Her throat still ached from the strain of the prophecy, but her mind was calm. There was a peace that came only after the voice had left her, an emptiness that felt almost sacred. The cicadas sang softly in the dusk. Far below, the valley shimmered with evening light. She wondered whether the god heard her thoughts as clearly as she heard his. Or was she, too, only an echo repeating words that had been spoken since time began? The priests said Apollo's voice entered her through the sacred vapors, that his divine essence filled her lungs. But she had begun to suspect something else, that the god's voice had always been inside her, sleeping, waiting for the silence to awaken it. That perhaps all humans carried that same spark, though most never learned to listen long enough to hear. The stars appeared one by one, shimmering like tiny oracles across the night. The wind carried whispers through the olive trees, and she closed her eyes to the sound. Somewhere within that endless murmur, she thought she could hear him again, not as command, not as prophecy, but as comfort. A reminder that the divine was not above the world, but within it. And so she listened, as she always had, not for the words, but for the space between them, where the truest voice of the gods still waited to be heard. Days at Delphi moved like breath, slow, deliberate, eternal. The priests swept the marble courtyards at dawn, their sandals whispering across the stone. The fountains murmured endlessly, their waters carrying the scent of laurel and pine. Even when the temple stood empty, it felt alive, as though the god himself lingered in the quiet air between the columns. The Pythia walked among them unseen, her presence both mortal and sacred. Children would sometimes glimpse her from afar and lower their eyes, as though the sun itself had looked their way. Yet to those who truly watched, she seemed ordinary, tired, soft-spoken, her steps slow from the weight of visions. The divine, after all, did not need spectacle. It preferred silence. At night, she dreamed of the mountain's heart. In her sleep, she saw golden light pulsing beneath the earth, flowing like rivers through black stone. Voices called to her from the depths, not in words, but in emotion, in knowing. She woke with tears on her cheeks, unable to remember what had been said, yet certain it was not meant to be forgotten. Some mornings, she would visit the cliffs above Delphi and watch the sun rise over the valley. Below her, the olive groves shimmered like green waves, and the smoke of cooking fires curled upward from distant villages. She would whisper the names of those she had spoken for, kings, soldiers, widows, children, and hope the gods were merciful. The priests guarded her closely, yet they too began to fear what the gift might cost. Each prophecy took something from her, a sliver of strength, a fragment of memory, a measure of her voice. They whispered that no Pythia ever lived long, that to speak for the divine was to burn slowly from within. And still she returned, day after day, to the fisher's breath and the waiting silence. When she entered the Aditon, the air felt thicker than before. The scent of laurel was stronger, the warmth more intense. She knelt beside the tripod and closed her eyes. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a flicker, a vibration, a stirring deep within her ribs like the first note of a song. The god was near. The priests above began their chant. Their voices echoed softly down the stone passage, weaving through her pulse until she could no longer tell which sound belonged to her. The world folded inward. Time unraveled. She opened her mouth and let the breath of the god become her own. The prophecy this time came in fragments, images rather than speech. A golden bird burning, a city drowning beneath silver rain, a king kneeling before his own reflection. The words she spoke were wild, unshaped, more feeling than language. Yet those who heard them would build temples around their meaning, and wars would follow. Such was the weight of divine truth, even when veiled in dream. When it ended, she did not rise. The priests found her still seated upon the tripod, her hands limp at her sides. For a moment they thought she was gone, another voice consumed by the god's fire. But then she stirred, her eyes half open, her lips moving faintly. "He does not speak to me," she murmured. "He speaks through all things." They carried her to the temple's inner chamber, laid her upon woven cloth, and waited for her breath to steady. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley, though the sky remained clear. The mountain exhaled again, and a scent like lightning filled the air. That night, when she woke, she did not call for the priests. Instead, she rose and stepped into the courtyard. The stars were blindingly bright, the constellations ancient and unchanging. Somewhere in their pattern, she thought she could see Apollo's face, not stern, not distant, but weary like hers. She understood then that the god's voice was not bound to her alone. It lived in the wind that touched the olive leaves, in the murmuring springs, in the hearts of those who dared to listen. She was merely an echo, a vessel through which the world reminded itself of its own divinity. The next morning, when the first pilgrim arrived seeking counsel, she did not descend into the Aditon. Instead, she stood in the temple's open air, beneath the wide blue sky, and spoke softly. Her words were simple, no riddles, no mystery, only a truth as old as the mountain itself. The gods dwell where silence is honored. The pilgrim bowed, not understanding, yet feeling the weight of it all the same. And when he left, the wind rose gently through the columns, carrying her voice across the valley, faint, eternal, like the breath of the god who had never left. That was the last prophecy she ever gave. In time, others would take her place, and the world would remember her words differently, embellished, rearranged, made to fit the songs of kings. But for those who had stood beside her, who had felt the tremor in the air as she spoke, there was no question. The god had been real, and he had spoken through her not as a master, but as a mirror, showing humanity what it had forgotten to see. And so the voice of the gods continued, not in smoke or thunder, but in every quiet moment when the world paused long enough to listen. Beneath the marble steps of Delphi, beneath the songs and prayers that filled the mountain air, there was another world, silent, hidden, and alive with ancient breath. Few had seen it. Fewer still had dared to speak of it. The priests called it simply the foundation, but those who served longest whispered that it was something far older than any temple. The temple above shone with order and reason, columns of harmony, light dancing upon white stone. But below, the air grew warm, heavy with the scent of minerals and earth. It was said that the mountain's heart beat there, that its pulse could be felt in the faint tremor beneath one's feet, steady as time itself. The first chambers were carved roughly, their walls marked by tools long lost to memory. Torchlight revealed faint carvings, spirals, suns, serpents, symbols from a time before Apollo, before gods had names. The priests avoided looking at them too long. They said the lines seemed to move, to twist slightly when one turned away. In the lowest passages, the air shimmered with something unseen. The stone was moist, breathing faint mist from cracks that glowed faintly in the dark. That was where the vapors came from, the invisible thread between the mortal and divine. It hissed softly, rising through the fissure into the temple above, where the oracle sat waiting. The ancients had called this breath the pneuma. Some said it was the voice of Gaia herself, the Earth Mother whose whispers had once filled this place before Apollo's light arrived. Others claimed it was the last breath of the serpent python, sealed forever in stone, dreaming still of vengeance and sky. No one knew for certain. The priests only knew that the vapors held power, and power demanded ritual. Each morning, they would descend with bowls of laurel leaves, casting them into the cracks to purify the air. The leaves sizzled softly, their scent mingling with the mineral tang of the mountain's breath. Then, as the first rays of dawn touched the temple's roof above, they would retreat, leaving the silence behind. There were stories, of course, tales told by torchlight when the winds outside howled through the Parnassian cliffs. Some said that if one stayed too long beneath the temple, they would hear voices whispering through the stone. Some said the voices were kind, guiding, like old friends calling from afar. Others swore they were hungry, echoes of those who had once entered and never returned. One old attendant, blind from birth, had been allowed to walk those corridors freely. He claimed he could feel the pulse of the god beneath his hands, could trace the flow of power through the veins of rock. "It is not Apollo," he once murmured to a young novice. "It is the world itself. He merely borrows its tongue." The novice never repeated those words aloud. At times, faint tremors would rattle the foundation. Dust would drift down through the cracks, and the lamps would flicker. The priests would pause, crossing themselves in the old way, as if to appease something deeper than prayer. For though they served Apollo, they all knew the earth belonged to someone else, something older, patient, and unyielding. During festivals, when thousands came to Delphi, the Pythia would spend hours within that chamber, her body swaying above the fissure. And though her words rose toward the heavens, her voice always began in the deep, in that unseen world below, where the stones still remembered the serpent's fall. The Romans who later visited Delphi marveled at the temple's beauty, but could not understand its silence. They searched for the secret of the vapors, cutting into rock, measuring fissures and burning herbs. Yet what they found was only emptiness, a mystery that refused to be measured. The air was ordinary. The ground was dry. The god had hidden his breath, but those who had once served here, who had lived their lives listening to the earth's murmur, knew the truth. The god's silence was not absence, it was transformation. Power never vanished, it merely sank deeper, waiting for a world that still believed in whispers. And so the passages beneath Delphi remained, dark and patient, long after the last prophecy had been spoken. The cracks still breathed faintly, exhaling dust and memory. The carvings still glowed faintly under the touch of a trembling hand. Somewhere far below, the last echo of the serpent still coiled and dreamed, not dead, only sleeping. The mountain would always remember. It had seen gods rise and fade, seen empires crumble into the dust that now lay upon its floors. The temple above might fall, its columns scattered, its altars forgotten, but the secrets beneath would endure. For the gods, like the earth, never truly left. They merely moved deeper into the silence, waiting for someone to listen again. The deeper one went beneath the temple, the less the world seemed to belong to light. The air grew warm, yet the warmth felt unearthly, not the comfort of fire, but the kind that rose from unseen places, old as time. Each step echoed differently, as if the walls themselves were listening. Few mortals had ever reached the lowest chamber. It was said that only the oldest priests, chosen before death, were permitted to see it once in their lives. They called it the vein of the earth. And it was there that the mountain's pulse could be felt most clearly, a slow rhythm, vast and eternal, beating far below mortal understanding. Those who descended carried no torches. They said fire was forbidden in the vein, for it disturbed the god's dream. Instead, they walked by the pale glow of minerals that shimmered along the stone, a strange luminescence, faint and shifting, as though the mountain itself breathed light. The walls there were carved smooth by hands that could not have been human. Some claimed the gods themselves had hollowed this place, long before Delphi bore a name. In the stone, one could trace the faint impression of serpentine coils, looping endlessly, the mark of Python, or perhaps something older still. When the priests reached the final chamber, they would kneel and place their palms upon the ground. The warmth beneath their skin would rise gently, like blood beneath flesh. Some heard whispers, others heard silence. All returned changed, quiet, reverent, unable to describe what they had felt. It was there, they said, that the oracle's visions were born, not in the fumes alone, but in the deep vibration of the world's heart. The vapors merely carried the message upward, like smoke bearing a dream. The Pythia, sitting above the fissure, became the bridge, her body the instrument, her voice the note. Long ago, before Apollo's priests came, shepherds had found this place by accident. They had followed a lost goat into the cracks and discovered it trembling, foam at its mouth, eyes wide with terror and awe. The men who entered after it soon felt the same strange power rising through their bones. They spoke in tongues, laughed and wept, saw flashes of golden fire. When they emerged, they swore they had seen the gods, and so Delphi became sacred, not through command, but through revelation. The mountain itself had chosen its worshippers, yet the priests, in their devotion, feared the formlessness of such power. They built walls, shaped ritual, gave names to what had none. They taught that it was Apollo who spoke, though deep down they knew it was the same old voice that had always lived beneath the earth, the whisper of Gaia, dreaming through stone. One scroll, hidden among temple records, spoke of a night when the fissure widened. The earth split open beneath the altar, and a bright mist rose like a pillar of glass. The priests panicked, fearing the end. But the Pythia stood above it calmly, her eyes unblinking, and spoke words no one could later recall. When it was over, the crack sealed itself again, and the mountain fell silent for 7 days. They said afterward that Apollo had descended then, not as light, but as breath. That he had merged with the ancient power below, binding his essence to the earth forever. From that day, no prophecy was ever spoken without his name, and yet the silence beneath the temple seemed to grow heavier each century. When the Romans came, they noticed the same trembling beneath the floor. Engineers examined the fissure, trying to find its source. They wrote of strange gases, of sulfur and ethylene, the language of men who no longer believed in gods. But the truth was simpler and more terrifying. The world was alive, and Delphi was its mouth. Sometimes, in the stillness of midnight, the attendants would hear faint music rising from below, a low hum, like the sound of a string plucked in the dark. It had no rhythm, no melody, only presence. They called it the heartbeat of the god. One priest, overcome by curiosity, descended alone one night. He carried no laurel, no offering, only questions. He was never seen again. But in the morning, a new crack had appeared near the fissure, thin as a hair, breathing a single thread of warm air. Some said the mountain had taken him. Others whispered that he had simply gone too deep, to where even the gods could not follow. Delphi was built upon a living mystery, and those who served there understood that truth demanded reverence, not possession. The temple was not a throne for the divine, but a veil, a fragile layer between the known and the eternal. And beneath that veil, the earth waited, dreaming in heat and stone. The priests would tell the Pythia that the gods spoke through her. But perhaps when she inhaled those vapors and the visions came, it was not a god at all who whispered, but the earth itself, remembering what it once was. Night fell softly over Delphi. The last of the pilgrims had gone, and the mountain exhaled into silence. The marble steps still held the warmth of day, but the air was cool now, fragrant with laurel and dust. High above, the stars turned slowly, and their reflections shimmered faintly upon the white stone, as if the heavens themselves were gazing down at their mirror on earth. Within the temple, the oracle slept. Her chamber was small and bare, a mat, a basin, a few olive branches laid neatly beside her. Yet even in slumber, her breath came uneven, caught between the worlds she straddled. Sometimes her lips would move, whispering fragments of visions that drifted away before they formed. The priests would listen, recording what they could, though often the meaning escaped them entirely. One night, when the wind was low and the moon shone like polished bone, the chief priest descended alone into the depths. His torch flared softly against the stone, throwing long shadows along the curved walls. He had served the temple for 40 years and had watched countless prophecies spoken into being. Yet tonight, his heart trembled as though it were his first day beneath the mountain. He had come seeking an answer that was not meant for the crowds above. For years he had wondered if the voice of Apollo was truly divine, or merely the echo of the world below, a trick of gases, a dream born of vapors and human need. Yet now, standing at the edge of the fissure, he no longer sought to prove or disprove. He only wanted to understand. He knelt, feeling the warmth of the stone beneath his palms. The breath of the earth rose gently, coiling around his hands. It smelled faintly of myrrh and ash, sweet and ancient. He closed his eyes and listened. At first there was nothing, only the faint rustle of air. Then, from deep within the rock, a whisper began to form. It was not a voice exactly, but a vibration, low and steady, that hummed through his bones. He leaned closer. The sound grew clearer, soft as water over sand. And then, suddenly, he understood. It was not speaking to him, but through him. The words came from nowhere and everywhere at once, carried on the breath of the mountain itself. "Child of stone," it murmured, "you have dressed me in names and prayers, but I was here before language. Before gods were born, I breathed. Before light, I dreamed. You built walls above me, but I have never been contained." The priest's breath caught. His torch trembled in his hand. "What are you?" he whispered. The mountain's voice was a sigh. "I am what you seek when you bow your head. I am what you fear when you close your eyes. I am memory made matter, dream made earth. I am the quiet between your questions." He felt tears warm his face. The words were not cruel, not kind, only vast, infinite, indifferent. "You call me Apollo," the whisper continued. "Before that, you called me Gaia. Before that, I had no name at all. Yet I have always been the same. When you breathe, you echo me. When you speak, I awaken. I do not choose your prophets. You choose to listen." The torch went out. Darkness swallowed everything, yet he did not move. He could still feel the pulse beneath his hands, steady and real. In that moment, he understood the oracle, not as a woman possessed, but as a vessel open to something immense, something that did not belong to any god or age. When he finally climbed back toward the surface, dawn was breaking. The temple glowed faintly in the new light, its marble soft and golden. He emerged quietly, the scent of stone still clinging to his robes. He did not speak of what he had heard. To explain it would be to diminish it. Instead, he simply bowed before the rising sun, not to Apollo, but to the endless breath that moved through all things. Years passed. The oracle continued her work. Empires rose and fell. The Romans came, then the Christians, each taking the temple and bending its meaning toward their own light. The fissure was sealed. The songs stopped, yet the mountain remained. Even now, if you walk among the ruins at Delphi when the wind falls still and the air is heavy with heat, you might feel it, a warmth beneath the stones, faint but living. The ground hums softly, as if it remembers every question ever whispered to it, every prayer offered, every dream unspoken. And sometimes, late at night, when the stars hang low and the world is quiet, you might hear it again, not a sound, but a feeling rising from beneath your feet, the breath of the earth, the memory of gods, the echo of something vast, waiting, patient, eternal, for the oracle was never the source. She was only the window, a voice for the mountain that dreamed beneath her. The temple above may crumble, the names may fade, but the whisper endures. It does not speak in words anymore, only in silence. Yet if you listen, truly listen, you might still hear it. And when you do, you will understand what the priest once did. That prophecy was never about seeing the future. It was about remembering that the world itself is alive, and that we, for a brief moment, are allowed to hear it breathe. The road to Delphi was not simply a path through the mountains. It was a pilgrimage through time itself. Each stone, Each turn of the winding trail held the whispers of those who had come before. From kingdoms far beyond the Aegean, travelers made the ascent, carrying questions heavier than their offerings. Kings uncertain of war, farmers begging for rain, lovers trembling before fate's unknown hand. They began their climb at dawn, when the mist still clung to the olive trees. The air smelled of resin and dust, and the distant sound of a lyre carried faintly through the valley. The pilgrims walked slowly, guided by the sacred road that wound upward toward the navel of the world, the omphalos, where earth and heaven were said to meet. Some came barefoot, their feet cut and blistered, believing pain would make their prayers more pure. Others rode on mules draped in garlands, their attendants carrying baskets of honey, gold, and laurel. Yet whether clothed in linen or wrapped in rags, all approached with the same quiet awe. The nearer they came to Delphi, the more the world below seemed to fade, until the only sound left was the murmur of wind along the rocks, like the breath of something ancient waiting. Along the way stood shrines from every land touched by Apollo's light. Small statues watched the pilgrims pass, gods of harvest, of healing, of justice, their faces worn smooth by centuries of devotion. Offerings lay before them, broken cups, coins, petals from faraway fields. Each token was a conversation with the divine, a fragile attempt to be heard. As the road curved higher, the air grew thinner, scented with smoke and laurel leaves. The mountain itself seemed to hum beneath their feet. From below, Delphi shimmered in the haze, marble columns gleaming like ivory against the dark flank of Parnassus. The pilgrims would stop then, resting on the stones, gazing upward in silence. To see the temple even from afar was to feel the gravity of faith itself. They spoke little. Some prayed beneath their breath, others kept their thoughts locked inside, afraid the gods might overhear too soon. A young woman from Thebes carried a locket of her mother's hair, hoping the oracle might tell her if her child yet unborn would live. A soldier from Sparta bore a simple spear and asked not for victory, but for forgiveness. A merchant from Athens brought a statue of gold, and in his heart a single fear, that all his wealth would one day mean nothing. By midday, they reached the Castalian spring, where cool water flowed through a cleft in the rock. Here they bathed body and spirit, washing away the dust of their journeys. The water was said to hold Apollo's blessing. Each drop shimmered like liquid light. Pilgrims cupped it in their hands, whispering their names into it as though giving them back to the earth. Beyond the spring lay the gates of Delphi. The sun burned high, and the marble steps glowed like fire. The priests stood waiting in their robes of white and gold, their faces calm and unreadable. They spoke the sacred greetings, their voices soft as music. The smell of incense drifted through the air, heavy with promise. For many, that moment, standing before the temple, was the summit of their lives. Few ever met the oracle directly, yet none left untouched. Even the silence of Delphi was a kind of answer. The air itself seemed alive, filled with unseen presences, as if the gods listened to every heartbeat. Some pilgrims trembled. Others wept without knowing why. It was said that before Apollo would reveal his truth, each seeker must first reveal themselves, stripped of pride, of certainty, of everything except the small light that burned within. And so they waited. Under the blinding sun, amid the sound of chanting and wind, they waited for the mountain to speak. At the threshold of the temple, the world seemed to slow. The marble steps gleamed beneath the sun, and the wind carried the faint scent of myrrh, rising from unseen braziers deep within. The pilgrims approached in silence, their shadows long against the white stone, their eyes lowered as though the mountain itself watched them. Before they could enter, each was led to a basin of pure water drawn from the Castalian spring. They dipped their hands, touched their foreheads, and whispered their names to the gods. It was not the name they were born with, but the one their hearts had become, the name shaped by longing, by guilt, by hope. The priests said the water remembered these names, carrying them down into the hidden fissures of the earth where Apollo listened. After purification came offering. Some brought laurel branches, others small figures carved from ivory or clay. Wealthier pilgrims laid gold or silver bowls upon the altars, engraved with prayers in forgotten tongues. Yet even the poorest, who owned nothing but the dust upon their feet, could give something sacred, a song, a tear, a whisper. The gods, it was said, cared little for the gift itself. They listened only to the silence between the words. Inside, the air was cool and dim. Shafts of sunlight pierced the columns, dust drifting like pale spirits in their glow. Murals lined the walls, images of gods and heroes, of wars and storms, of peace that lasted only for a breath. The pilgrims moved slowly, their footsteps soft upon the worn stone floor. Every sound, the scrape of sandals, the flutter of robes, seemed magnified in the vast stillness. At the heart of the temple stood the great bronze tripod, its legs shaped like intertwining serpents. Upon it sat a golden bowl filled with laurel leaves and water. The scent of burning resin hung heavy in the air, mingling with something subtler, something that seemed to rise from the very rock itself, warm, sweet, and strange. This was the sacred vapor, the breath of the mountain. The priests said it was the voice of Apollo, drawn up through the earth to speak through the oracles chosen. They alone tended it, ensuring it burned neither too faint nor too fierce, for the balance between worlds was fragile, easily disturbed. As the pilgrims waited, a low hum filled the chamber. It was not music, not exactly, but a kind of rhythm, a pulse that matched the beating of their hearts. From the shadows beyond the altar, the priestess appeared, robed in white, crowned with laurel. Her steps were slow and measured, her face serene, as though she walked through two worlds at once. She took her place beside the tripod. The priests encircled her, chanting softly in a language older than the stones themselves. The sound wove through the air like smoke, wrapping the pilgrims in calm. One by one, the seekers stepped forward, each allowed a single question. They spoke of love, of loss, of power, of fear. One asked whether his city would win the coming war. Another asked if a child would be born whole. Some asked of fate, others asked only to be seen. The priestess listened, her eyes half closed, her lips moving with words no one could hear. Then she inhaled, deeply, slowly, and the mountain exhaled through her. Her voice came soft at first, then stronger, rippling through the temple like wind through reeds. The pilgrims fell silent. The priests listened intently, their wax tablets ready to record each syllable. Yet the words came not as answers, but as riddles, half light, half shadow. The way forward, she murmured, is not always ahead. The seed must vanish to be reborn. What you lose in the fire, you will find in the ashes. The seeker trembled. He did not understand, not yet, but something within him stirred, as if truth itself had brushed his soul. The priests bowed, marking the prophecy. The next pilgrim stepped forward, and the ritual began again. Outside, the wind rose. Laurel branches swayed. The scent of incense drifted down the mountainside, and the sound of chanting echoed faintly across the valley. Those waiting beyond the gates looked up, wondering if their names had already reached the ears of the god. Inside, the oracle spoke on, her words weaving through time like threads of gold and smoke. No one knew where her voice truly came from, the temple, the mountain, or the heart of the listener. But all who heard it left changed, as though the mountain had breathed through them too. When the last prophecy was spoken, silence drifted through the temple like mist over still water. The air was heavy with incense, with breath held too long, with wonder that words could not name. The priestess sat motionless, her eyes closed, her hands resting lightly on her knees. She looked both fragile and infinite, a figure caught between waking and the dream of the mountain. The priests approached softly, lowering their heads in reverence. They recorded her final utterances upon wax tablets, careful not to let a single syllable escape. Then they extinguished the torches one by one, until only a thin beam of light remained, filtering down through a narrow opening above the altar. It touched the stone like a blessing. The ceremony was over. Outside, the pilgrims waited. The sun was already lowering behind the peaks, painting the sky in hues of rose and bronze. One by one, they were called to receive the oracle's words, translated softly by the priests. Some wept with joy. Others stared in quiet disbelief. A few smiled faintly, as though the answer they had received was not the one they had sought, but the one they had needed. No one left unchanged. Even those whose prophecies remained shrouded in mystery walked away lighter, as though a great silence within them had been acknowledged. The gods, after all, did not speak plainly. Their language was the turning of leaves, the shape of smoke, the dream that fades when morning comes. At the Castalian spring, the pilgrims paused once more to drink and cleanse themselves before descending. The water was cool and silver under the fading light. They cupped it in their palms, and for a moment it felt alive, as if it carried whispers from the temple above. Some touched it to their eyes, to their hearts, to the earth itself. Then they began their slow journey downward. The path that had seemed steep and endless on the way up now felt different. Each stone, each olive branch, each twist of the road was known to them, familiar and quiet. The valley below glowed golden, and the air was filled with the hum of cicadas. For the first time, they heard the world not as noise, but as song. Among them walked a young woman who had asked if her child would live. The oracle's words had been simple. Where the river bends, life will return. She did not yet know what they meant, but she felt a calm she had never known. A soldier carried his spear no longer as a weapon, but as a walking staff. A merchant, who had once feared losing everything, now found himself admiring the colors of the evening sky, thinking that gold had never shone so brightly. They spoke softly to one another as they walked, not of the gods, but of home, of the scent of bread, of the sound of sea wind through sails. The prophecy had given them no map, yet each felt guided, as though some unseen thread now bound them to the pulse of the world. When night came, they made camp along the road. Fires flickered in the darkness, small and trembling beneath the stars. Some prayed. Others simply watched the constellations turn, Orion rising over Parnassus, the Pleiades glittering faintly in the east. Above them, the Temple of Delphi gleamed like a memory carved into the mountainside. And though miles separated them from the oracle's chamber, they still felt her presence, not as a voice, but as a stillness, vast and tender. It was said that the gods' words did not end when spoken. They echoed through the heart of whoever had the courage to listen. In time, they would return to their cities and fields, to the routines of mortal life. Yet a part of them would remain upon that mountain, where stone met sky and the unseen breathed through all things. They would dream of Delphi in their sleep, the gleam of marble, the scent of laurel, the trembling warmth of the earth beneath their hands. And perhaps, in quiet moments, when the wind sighed through the trees or the water rippled without reason, they would remember what it felt like to stand before the sacred voice, to ask a question of the gods, and to realize that the answer was not given, but discovered within themselves. For that was the true gift of Delphi, not the prophecy, but the awakening. The pilgrims thought they had come seeking the future, but what they found was far older, a reminder that the divine lives not in temples or words, but in the breath between them. As the fires dimmed and sleep claimed them, the mountain stood silent under the stars, eternal and patient. It had seen countless pilgrims come and go, countless questions rise and fade. Yet still it waited for the next traveler, the next whisper, the next heart brave enough to listen. And somewhere within its depths, faint and eternal, the earth breathed on. Time, even for sacred places, is a patient eroder. Long after the golden age of prophecy had passed, Delphi still stood beneath the same blue sky, its columns pale and proud against the cliffs of Parnassus. Yet the air felt different. The songs of the priests no longer carried as far. The crowds that once filled the sacred road now came fewer, their footsteps echoing in the empty courtyards where once the voices of nations had gathered. It began not with a storm, but with silence. The fissures beneath the temple, the breath of the god, grew faint. Some said the earth had cooled, that the vapors no longer rose. Others whispered that Apollo himself had turned away, weary of men's endless questions. Whatever the truth, the oracle's voice weakened, and her words grew sparse, like the final embers of a dying fire. Still, she spoke when called upon. But the visions came slower, and the trance left her frail. The priests tended her carefully, lighting more incense, chanting longer, praying louder, as though devotion alone could coax the mountain to speak again. Yet the whispers that once filled the air with mystery now seemed thin, uncertain, almost human. Outside the temple walls, the world was changing. New powers rose across the sea, empires of reason, of trade, of iron. Kings now turned to generals instead of prophets. Philosophers questioned the nature of truth, asking if the gods had ever spoken at all. The old faiths, once the pillars of life, began to tremble under the weight of new thought. But Delphi endured, proud and stubborn. The pilgrims still came, though fewer with each passing year. They came not with gold, but with curiosity, as though visiting the tomb of a once great king. The path up the mountain grew overgrown, the shrines along the road cracked and crumbled. Yet still the temple shone at sunset, its marble glowing like the last warmth of a fading sun. The priestess who served then was old, older than anyone could remember. Her hair had turned the color of ash, her hands thin and trembling, yet her eyes still held the fire of something beyond mortal sight. She had given her life to the god, and though his voice came now in whispers, she waited faithfully each dawn for the breath of the mountain. One morning, as the mist drifted low across the valley, she rose before the others. The air was still, heavy with the scent of damp earth. She walked alone into the temple, her steps soft upon the worn stone. The altar still bore the offerings of those who had come the day before, coins, flowers, small carvings of wood and bone. She knelt, touching the floor, and felt the faint warmth beneath her palm. "Are you still there?" she whispered. Her voice echoed softly, fading into the hollow air. "If you are silent, I will still listen. If you are gone, I will still wait." The mountain gave no answer. Only a small tremor passed through the ground, gentle as a sigh. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she thought she heard it, the faint hum that had once filled her soul. But when she opened them again, there was only the quiet. Outside, the first light touched the ruins of the treasuries, the statues, the altars. Birds stirred in the olive trees, their wings glinting like fragments of forgotten gold. The priestess watched the dawn and smiled faintly. Perhaps, she thought, the god had not left at all. Perhaps he had simply fallen asleep within the earth, dreaming the world into new forms. That morning, the priests found her still kneeling, her face serene, her body cold. In her hand she held a single laurel leaf, still green despite the night. They buried her in silence, beneath the shadow of the temple she had served. And when the wind passed over the stones, it carried with it the faintest trace of her voice, or perhaps the mountains. For even in its fading, Delphi did not die. It lingered, suspended between worlds, no longer a place of prophecy, but a memory of what it meant to believe that the earth itself could speak. Seasons turned upon the mountain, and Delphi grew quiet. The temple still stood, its marble bright beneath the sun, but the songs that once filled its chambers had grown faint, replaced by the sigh of wind through broken pillars. Time moved differently there now, slower, heavier, like the breath of a sleeping god. After the death of the last priestess, the priests kept their vigil, but fewer pilgrims came. The road that had once glimmered with processions was overrun by grass and silence. The Castalian spring still flowed, clear and cold, but even its music seemed subdued, as though mourning the voice it once carried. Then came the Romans. Their banners glinted red against the cliffs as they climbed the sacred road, soldiers and senators, poets and conquerors alike. They did not come as destroyers, not yet, but as admirers of beauty, seekers of wonder. Delphi fascinated them. They rebuilt its terraces, restored its altars, and listened with curiosity to the few who still claimed to hear Apollo's breath. For a time, the oracle spoke again, though her voice was weaker, her visions brief and shadowed. The Romans called her Pythia still, honoring the name though not the spirit. To them, Delphi was less a gateway to the divine and more a marvel of the ancient world, a place where myth and empire might shake hands. But even their reverence could not rekindle what time had taken. The fissures below the temple grew cold, the sacred vapors ceased to rise. The god's breath, once warm and alive, had become stone. When asked for counsel, the oracle would close her eyes, inhale and exhale only silence. The priests wrote her muteness as prophecy, calling it the god's refusal to speak. Yet in their hearts they knew the truth. The mountain had fallen asleep. Still, they preserved the rites not out of faith but remembrance. They lit the fires, they polished the bronze tripod, they sang the old hymns to an empty sky. And though they no longer felt the divine, they continued to act as if they did. For to stop would be to admit that the world had changed. Outside the temple, Delphi became a place of travelers and scholars. Poets came to write of its fading glory. Philosophers came to measure its stones and argue over its meaning. The echoes of the past mingled with the footsteps of the curious. Yet beneath it all, a quiet sorrow remained, the kind that lingers when something sacred has gone beyond reach. In time, storms began to gnaw at the mountain. Earthquakes cracked the marble, floods carved channels through the courtyards, statues toppled, laurel trees withered. The treasuries of kings lay in ruin, and still the priests refused to leave. The god will return, they said. The earth will breathe again. But history had other plans. Beyond Delphi, the world was changing, new gods rising, old ones fading. The fires of faith shifted toward Rome, and then to lands even farther. The names of Zeus and Apollo began to sound ancient, the language of another age. When the Christians came, they looked upon Delphi not with reverence, but with pity. To them, the oracle's silence was proof not of death, but of deliverance, that the old voices had been silenced by the new light. They built crosses where once laurel had grown, their hymns echoing where prayers to Apollo once rose. The last priest of Delphi, old and bent, watched from the shadows as the temple walls were torn apart stone by stone. He did not cry out. He only whispered a single phrase, one last prayer to the sleeping god. You will be remembered. As the sun sank behind the mountains, the sound of hammers faded and night settled upon the ruins. In the darkness, the mountain sighed, a long, low murmur, soft as sorrow. Perhaps it was only the wind. Or perhaps, beneath the broken marble and the sleeping fissures, the earth still dreamed of the time when men listened to its voice. For though the oracle had fallen, and her temple turned to dust, the silence she left behind was not empty. It was full of memory, of longing, of all the words never spoken. And sometimes, when the wind moves just right through the stones of Delphi, it carries that silence still, ancient, patient, alive. Long after the fires of Delphi had dimmed, travelers still came to stand among its ruins. They walked the same sacred path that once shimmered with golden offerings, their footsteps soft against the dust of centuries. The air held the scent of pine and ancient stone, and when the wind swept through the hollow columns, it sounded almost like a voice. Almost. There was a strange peace there, not the peace of abandonment, but of rest. The mountain, which had once trembled with divine breath, now slept beneath a blanket of wildflowers. The laurel trees had returned, their roots curling through cracked marble, as if nature herself were reclaiming what had always been hers. Scholars wrote of Delphi with reverence, calling it the navel of the world, the place where heaven and earth once met. Yet for those who lingered too long among the ruins, something deeper stirred, a quiet sense that the stones themselves remembered. They whispered when touched by rain, murmured beneath the moonlight, and if one listened with a still heart, one might hear not words but feeling the echo of awe, the memory of faith. For though Apollo had gone silent, his presence never fully left. The myths told that he had only withdrawn, waiting for an age when humanity might listen once more. In dreams, he was said to appear, not as the god of thunder or war, but as light itself, soft and golden, reflected in the calm of morning after a storm. There were villagers who claimed that on certain nights, when mist drifted down from Parnassus, they could see a faint glow rising from the old temple stones. They said it was the breath of the god returning for a moment, to remember what it felt like to be believed in. The elders would smile and nod, saying that the mountain never forgets. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell, languages changed, and new gods took their place upon the altars of men. Yet Delphi endured, quiet and eternal, a scar upon time's face, beautiful and broken, like all things sacred that the world has outgrown. Pilgrims still arrived not for prophecy, but for silence. They came to feel the weight of ages, to stand where voices once spoke of destiny, and to wonder what it means when the gods stop answering. In that silence, some found peace. Others found sorrow. But all found reflection, a mirror held up by history, showing humanity's endless search for meaning. For what was the oracle, if not that? A symbol of the longing to know, to understand, to speak with something greater than ourselves. And perhaps that is why Delphi still calls to us. Not because of what was lost, but because of what remains, the unending desire to believe that the universe is listening. Even now, in the quiet hum of stars above the ruins, something of that yearning lingers. When the moonlight touches the worn steps of the temple, it paints them silver, and the air seems to shimmer, as though the god's presence were only just beyond the veil. The night hums softly, and if one were to close their eyes, they might imagine the faint scent of laurel, the flicker of torchlight, the whisper of a voice saying, "Know thyself." That simple phrase, once carved into Delphi's stones, has survived every ruin. It is more than a warning, it is a promise. That even when temples fall and gods grow quiet, the search within us never ceases. So the oracle sleeps, but her dream continues in art, in thought, in the pulse of every question humankind dares to ask. Her temple may be gone, her voice may be silent, but her spirit lives wherever wonder lingers. Tonight, as the stars drift over the ancient mountain, one might imagine the ghost of smoke rising again from the earth, the faint tremor of prophecy stirring in the dark. Not a voice commanding the world, only a whisper reminding it to listen. And perhaps that is Delphi's truest gift, not the knowledge of the gods, but the stillness they left behind. Long before the silence came, Delphi stood not only as a temple, but as a heart, pulsing quietly at the center of the ancient world. Travelers from every land once found their way to this mountainside, drawn by whispers of a god who spoke through mortal breath. From the shores of Ionia to the deserts of Egypt, from the olive valleys of Greece to the far kingdoms beyond the sea, they came, kings and philosophers, poets and wanderers, each bearing a question that only the oracle could answer. The path to Delphi was never easy. It wound through steep ravines and stony passes, where the air grew thin and the scent of pine hung heavy. Those who climbed it often did so in silence, as if the mountain itself demanded reverence. At every turn, the travelers would glimpse marble terraces gleaming above, like stairways to heaven. And when they reached the temple at last, they would find themselves surrounded not by noise or chaos, but by a deep, sacred calm, the stillness before revelation. To stand before the oracle was to stand between worlds. The earth below breathed through hidden fissures, warm and fragrant with unseen power, while the sky above shimmered with the god's light. When the Pythia spoke, her words carried that strange duality, the voice of a woman, and yet something more. The Greeks believed it was Apollo himself speaking through her, his truth filtered through human frailty. Others called it madness, but all who heard her left changed, as though the mountain had shifted something inside them. It was said that Delphi's wisdom shaped the course of nations. Themistocles, before the Persian Wars, sought guidance there, and her riddled words urged him to build a navy, a choice that saved Greece. Croesus of Lydia, richest of kings, came to ask if he should wage war, and though the oracle warned him that if he did, a great empire would fall, he failed to see that it might be his own. Her answers were never false, only veiled, like sunlight through fog. Beyond politics and prophecy, Delphi held a quieter power. It was a meeting place, where rival states sent envoys not for battle, but for counsel. Its Amphictyony, a sacred league of Greek tribes, gathered there in peace to maintain the temple and its laws. For a moment in history, it was proof that even in a world of conquest, the sacred could unite. But Delphi's influence stretched farther still, into the very soul of philosophy and art. It was there, at the temple gates, that the phrase "Know thyself" was first carved in stone. To some, it was divine instruction. To others, a riddle more profound than any prophecy. Socrates made it his life's creed, teaching that wisdom begins not in knowledge of the gods, but in the recognition of one's own ignorance. Thus, Delphi became not just a holy site, but a mirror reflecting humanity's longing for understanding. Every pilgrim came seeking answers and left instead with questions that would echo for generations. In that way, the oracle shaped not just empires, but the very idea of truth. The arts too found inspiration in her shadow. Poets sang of her fire, sculptors carved her likeness in marble, painters tried to capture the light of Apollo upon the mountain. The theater of tragedy, the hymns of poets, even the geometry of temples, all bore faint traces of Delphi's voice. It was as though her presence infused the air, a current of divine curiosity that swept across the ancient world. And yet, for all its grandeur, Delphi remained small, a single sanctuary perched upon a narrow ledge of stone, surrounded by wild cliffs and open sky. It was humble in scale, yet infinite in meaning. Travelers would write of the awe they felt not from the temple's size, but from its harmony with the mountain itself. Nature and stone seemed to breathe together there, as if creation had paused in reverence. When night fell over the ancient world, the fires of Delphi shone like stars. The sound of chanting rose from the courtyards, echoing against the walls of Parnassus. And somewhere within, the Pythia sat upon her tripod, her eyes closed, her body swaying gently to the rhythm of the god's invisible voice. In that glow of torchlight and mist, the world below seemed far away, the wars, the doubts, the endless striving of mankind. For those few moments of prophecy, only silence and eternity existed, and as each word of the oracle drifted into the air, it became more than guidance. It became memory, a thread woven into the vast fabric of the ancient world, glowing softly through the ages. The oracle's voice, though born in a single valley of Greece, carried far beyond its marble walls. It drifted across seas and mountains, reaching cities that had never seen the temple's glow. Through travelers, philosophers, and wandering priests, the wisdom of Delphi spread, not as doctrine, but as a kind of quiet fire, shaping the way civilizations thought about the sacred. In Egypt, scholars compared her visions to those of their own seers and dream interpreters. They spoke of breath and divine wind, and saw in Delphi's vapors a reflection of their ancient rites, the voice of gods moving through the unseen. In Persia, kings sent envoys to consult her, curious to test whether a foreign god might speak truth to their empire. Even in far Rome, the name of Delphi became a symbol of insight and mystery, a place where the universe itself seemed to speak through human lips. The oracle's fame grew not because of conquest, but because of wonder. No sword ever carried her influence. It moved instead on the soft footsteps of belief. To the ancient world, she represented something that transcended borders, a bridge between the mortal and the divine, between knowledge and faith. Her temple stood as proof that wisdom did not belong to one people alone, but to all who sought it. Merchants carrying goods across the Aegean would bring tales of her prophecies to distant ports. Soldiers returning from battle would whisper her words beside their campfires. Even the poets of far isles would weave her voice into their songs, calling her the woman who listens to the earth. And so, long before writing carried stories across time, Delphi's spirit traveled through memory and voice, eternal, because it lived in human longing. In Athens, philosophers debated her riddles as if they were puzzles set by the gods themselves. Plato wrote of the soul's ascent toward divine truth, echoing the oracle's command to know oneself. Aristotle pondered the balance of fate and choice, questions that the Pythia's visions had once stirred. Even centuries later, Stoics would look to her as a symbol of harmony, the still center within chaos, where the voice of reason meets the will of heaven. But Delphi's influence was not only intellectual, it shaped rituals, architecture, and art. Temples were built in imitation of hers, following her perfect alignment between earth and sky. Festivals were held to honor Apollo's return each spring, celebrating not just a god, but the awakening of light itself. To stand beneath the marble columns of any great sanctuary in Greece was in a way to stand in Delphi's shadow. And still, for all her grandeur, the oracle remained human. That was her truest power. She was not a god descending to speak, but a woman rising to listen. Her trembling, her ecstasy, her exhaustion, all were reminders that the divine, when it touched the world, did so through fragile flesh. In that fragility, people found meaning. They saw themselves reflected in her trance, mortal beings longing to be filled with something greater. The ancient world believed that the gods were everywhere, in the rustle of leaves, in the thunder's roll, in the dance of fire. But at Delphi, they seemed near enough to touch. The temple's harmony with the earth made it a place where heaven seemed to lean close, listening. And so, Delphi was never merely a location. It was an experience, one that changed how humanity saw itself in the cosmos. Even after her decline began, the memory of that experience endured. Historians wrote of her as one writes of a vanished star, its light still crossing the void long after the source had gone dark. Pilgrims continued to climb the sacred road, not to hear, but to remember. They knelt where the Pythia once sat, and though no words came, many swore they could still feel a pulse, faint but steady, rising from the stones beneath their hands. For Delphi was never only about the future. It was about the eternal present, the meeting of man, earth, and God. It was about the stillness that follows a question, the breath held in wonder, the quiet faith that something beyond the visible might answer. In that silence, the ancient world found its balance. And even now, as history drifts further from myth, the spirit of Delphi lingers, not in temples, but in the human heart, where every whispered prayer and every moment of reflection is an echo of that same sacred listening. As centuries drifted by, the world that once surrounded Delphi faded like an old dream. The empires that had sought her counsel fell to dust, their marble cities swallowed by earth and time. Yet Delphi endured, not in stone, but in story. Her voice, though long silent, lived on in the murmur of history, in the rhythm of thought, in the unending human need to listen for meaning beneath the noise of the world. The ancient travelers who once knelt at her altar became legends themselves. Their journeys, once measured by miles, were now measured by memory, each tale a thread in the great tapestry of belief. The oracle no longer spoke from the temple, yet she spoke through those stories, through the quiet faith of those who remembered what it felt like to be near her light. In the quiet centuries that followed, poets still invoked her name. They wrote of Delphi not as a ruin, but as a heartbeat. They imagined her voice rising from the stones on moonlit nights, her breath turning into mist that wandered down the valley. The philosophers of later ages, too, looked back toward her mountain when they sought to understand the nature of wisdom. To them, she was not a figure of myth, but a symbol, the moment when humankind first learned to listen inwardly, not upward. Even as the new faiths took hold, the essence of Delphi found a way to remain. The idea that the divine speaks softly, not in thunder, but in silence, passed into the language of saints and mystics. The mountain became a metaphor for the human soul, high, quiet, touched by light. In this way, the oracle's spirit survived her fall, her name reshaped by each era that remembered her. Artists of the Renaissance painted her in flowing robes, her eyes half closed in vision. To them, she was the embodiment of inspiration, the breath of creation itself. In her image, the muse and the prophet merged. The world no longer came to Delphi, but Delphi had found a home in the hearts of dreamers, where her whisper became the spark that lights every act of imagination. Travelers of the modern age still make the pilgrimage, though their reasons have changed. They climb the sacred road not to hear a prophecy, but to feel the echo of one. They stand among the ruins, the fallen columns, the broken statues, the silent stones, and watch the sun rise over the valley. The air there is still. The sound of cicadas fills the warm light. And sometimes, when the breeze passes through the old marble, it hums, a sound so soft it could almost be words. The guides speak of Apollo and Pythia, of earthquakes and ancient rituals, but the listeners often drift into silence, lost in something deeper. For Delphi is not only history, it is a mirror. It reflects the same longing that drew the ancients here, the yearning to know, to be known, to find meaning in the vastness. There is a moment, if one stands alone near the temple's heart, when the world seems to pause. The valley stretches below, green and endless. The air tastes of time. And in that stillness, one might understand what the oracle once meant, that the voice of the divine has never left us. It only changed its language. It now speaks through memory, through beauty, through the quiet awareness that everything sacred was never truly lost. As dusk settles, the mountain glows with a golden haze. Shadows lengthen across the stones, and for an instant, the ruins seem whole again, the columns upright, the altars bright, the air alive with song. It is only light playing tricks upon the mind, yet it feels real, as if the past were breathing once more. And when the last rays fade, the silence that follows feels almost holy. Perhaps this is what Delphi has become, not a place of prophecy, but of peace, a sanctuary where even in ruin, the soul can listen. For in every age, humanity returns to the same truth the oracle once spoke in riddles. That wisdom is not a voice from the heavens, but an awakening within. And so Delphi endures in thought, in art, in the quiet pulse of wonder that lives wherever we pause to listen. In the ancient world, prophecy was more than prediction. It was a bridge, a fragile thread that tied mortal hearts to the vast unknowable. When the oracle spoke, she did not merely foretell what would come. She revealed the mystery of being, the trembling edge between destiny and desire. To the ancients, her words were not commands, but mirrors, reflecting both the will of the gods and the secret thoughts of the one who asked. Every prophecy began the same way, with silence. Before the Pythia breathed the vapors or touched the sacred spring, there was always stillness, as though the world itself were holding its breath. That silence was sacred, for within it lived the uncertainty of all things, the space between knowing and not knowing. The pilgrims who came to Delphi did not only seek answers, they sought that silence, the moment before revelation, where hope and fear were equal, and the soul stood naked before eternity. To ask a question of the oracle was to offer oneself to mystery. Kings asked of wars, farmers asked of harvests, lovers asked of fate, and all received riddles in return. Her words were never direct, never kind or cruel, but balanced between meanings like light upon water. The truth was always there, yet never fixed. In this way, prophecy was not a gift given to mortals. It was a dialogue, a test of how deeply one could listen. For prophecy was never about the future, it was about the present moment stretched to its limit. It was about seeing the pattern within chaos, the echo of the eternal inside the ordinary. When the oracle spoke, What she truly revealed was not what would happen, but what already was, unseen, unacknowledged, waiting. The ancients believed that fate was a thread spun by divine hands, but that thread could twist, could shimmer with choice. The oracle's words were meant not to bind, but to awaken, to remind each listener that destiny was both given and made. The gods might whisper, but it was humankind who chose how to walk. In this, prophecy became a kind of poetry. It did not instruct, it evoked. It painted the future in symbols, in dreams, in trembling voices. A river might mean a journey, a serpent might mean wisdom or danger, a flame might mean a heart's awakening. The listeners would return home and ponder, reading and rereading the riddle as though decoding their own souls. Even philosophers, skeptical as they were, could not escape the pull of prophecy. To them, it represented the language of the universe, the way the unseen world spoke in patterns and omens. Plato wrote that the highest form of knowledge was anamnesis, remembering what the soul already knew. Perhaps the oracle's riddles were echoes of that same remembering, the mind's attempt to hear what the heart had never forgotten. But there was danger, too, in the longing to know. Some came to Delphi not in reverence, but in desperation, kings grasping for power, men demanding certainty from the divine. They wished for clarity, but prophecy was not meant for control. It was meant for humility. The more one sought to master the future, the more elusive it became. In that way, the oracle did not grant dominion over fate. She reminded mortals of their place within it. And yet, beneath all the riddles and warnings, there was a deeper tenderness in prophecy, a compassion hidden within the mystery. For what greater kindness could there be than to give the lost a glimpse of meaning, to remind the fearful that even their pain had a place in the design? The oracle's voice, though distant, offered that comfort. It said, "You are seen. You are part of something vast." Prophecy, in its truest form, was never about what might come, but what it means to hope. It was the music of longing, the melody that humankind has always sung to the unknown. And perhaps that is why Delphi endures even now, long after the god's breath has faded. For as long as we dream, as long as we wonder what lies ahead, the spirit of prophecy still stirs within us. And in that stirring, the mountain still breathes. Long after the last oracle fell silent, people still dreamed of hearing her voice. Even when her temple lay in ruins, when the laurel trees had withered and the sacred spring dried to a whisper, the yearning to know remained. For though Delphi had been a place upon a mountain, prophecy was never confined to stone or shrine. It lived in the human soul, waiting to be remembered. As the centuries passed, the world turned its gaze from gods to reason, from faith to philosophy. Yet even in the age of logic, the hunger for meaning endured. People no longer climbed mountains to seek answers, but they still asked the same questions, only now into the quiet of their own hearts. What should I do? What lies ahead? Is my path chosen, or do I choose it as I walk? The ancient voice became inward. The whispers that once rose from the earth now rose from within the mind itself. Perhaps this was the true transformation of prophecy, from an oracle's utterance to a human intuition. The temple may have crumbled, but the act of listening had survived. In this way, every person became their own Delphi. Every dream, coincidence, and sudden knowing became a kind of message. We began to see the world not as chaos, but as a vast tapestry where meaning shimmered between the threads. A bird crossing the sky, a song heard at the right moment, the pattern of light through the trees, all these could speak, if one only listened. The ancients called it mantike, the sacred art of interpreting signs. Modern minds might call it instinct or insight. Yet both describe the same mystery, that sometimes, without reason or proof, we simply know. The voice of prophecy did not die, it changed its language, learned to speak in the stillness of human thought. But to listen to that inner oracle requires courage. It asks that we pause amid the noise, that we wait through the silence, and allow something deeper than reason to rise. It is not an easy thing to do. The world teaches us to move, to act, to decide quickly. Yet prophecy teaches us to wait, to dwell in uncertainty, to let meaning reveal itself in its own time. The ancients understood this patience. They knew that the oracle's riddles could not be forced open. They had to unfold like dawn, softly, in their own rhythm. Those who left Delphi often did not understand their answers until years later, when the pieces of their lives aligned with the words once spoken. Perhaps we are still learning that same patience today, to trust that understanding comes not when we demand it, but when we are ready to receive it. For prophecy, at its heart, is not about control. It is about surrender. It asks that we let go of certainty and walk with faith in the unseen. The oracle did not give directions, she gave reflections. And in those reflections, the questioner often found not the future, but themselves. That, perhaps, is the hidden beauty of prophecy. It is not the gods telling us what will be, but reminding us of what already is. That within us lies both the question and the answer, the path and the traveler, the dream and the dreamer. The divine does not dictate, it reflects. And so prophecy becomes the act of seeing one's own soul illuminated by something greater. Even today, when we pause beneath the night sky, when we sense the pull of fate or the quiet certainty of intuition, we are continuing the same ancient ritual. We are still listening, not to the earth's vapors, but to the breath of our own being. And if we listen closely enough, the voice we hear might not be the gods at all, but the echo of our own timeless spirit, remembering what it has always known. For prophecy was never lost. It simply moved from the stone chambers of Delphi into the chambers of the human heart. And there, it still waits, whispering softly to any who are willing to be still long enough to hear. Even as the centuries drifted on, Delphi remained, not in form but in spirit, a ruin that still whispered through the dust. Travelers who climbed its mountain long after its silence spoke of a strange stillness, as if the air itself remembered. The stones, weathered and cracked, seemed to hum faintly when touched, as though echoes of long-forgotten voices were still passing through them. In that hush, one could almost imagine the priestess again, seated above the chasm, her eyes distant, her breath rising with unseen vapors. The temple was gone, the laurel trees long turned to ash, yet the feeling remained, that this was a place where the divine and the human once met in a trembling exchange of words and wonder. Perhaps that is the true nature of prophecy, not a prediction, but a bridge. A moment when the infinite leans close enough for us to feel its breath. The ancients wrapped this mystery in the trappings of ritual and smoke, but beneath it all lay something timeless, the yearning to be understood by something greater than ourselves. Over time, the language of prophecy transformed again. Painters began to seek it on canvas, musicians in their melodies, poets in their lines. Each tried to catch that flicker, that trembling thread between chaos and clarity, between the known and the unknown. And in this way, prophecy found new voices. It no longer required a temple, it only needed a soul willing to listen. Every artist who gazes at the empty page, every thinker who stares into the unknown, becomes a modern oracle. They wait for inspiration, for something unseen to arrive, gentle and certain as a whisper through time. The ancients called it divine madness, we call it creativity. But both are the same current, flowing through different vessels, guiding hands and hearts toward meaning. The poets of old often said that inspiration came from the muses, daughters of memory. And perhaps that is prophecy's final secret, that to foresee is not to look forward, but to remember. That the visions we call divine are the echoes of truths we already carry, waiting to resurface. The future and the past are mirrors facing one another, and between them stands the human soul, catching glimpses of eternity. So when the oracle spoke, she was not merely revealing what would come, she was awakening what had always been. Her riddles were not puzzles to be solved, but keys to self-recognition. They led her listeners back to their own depths, where fate and choice intertwined like roots beneath the earth. Even now, in moments of stillness, in the pause before dawn, in the hush of thought just before sleep, we may feel that same current stir. It is the memory of Delphi that lingers in us all, reminding us that the sacred is not far away, but always near, always whispering through the heart's quiet corridors. Prophecy, then, is not a map. It is a mirror. It shows us not where to go, but who we are becoming. It reflects the unspoken dialogue between our longing and the vastness that listens back. The gods may have faded, their temples fallen, yet the act of seeking remains eternal, the gentle, human desire to find meaning in the murmur of existence. And so the oracle's voice continues, though her name is dust. It moves through dreams, through music, through the small moments when time feels thin and the world seems to breathe with us. She speaks in the way light touches stone, in the rhythm of the sea, in the memory of every question ever asked beneath the stars. If we listen, truly listen, we might hear her even now, not as sound but as stillness, not as words but as knowing. She tells us that the future is not fixed, but fluid, that wisdom is not found in answers, but in the courage to wonder. The Oracle of Delphi is gone, yet prophecy endures, for as long as there are hearts that listen and dreams that seek to understand. Tonight, as the mountains sleep and the winds move softly through the valleys, imagine her voice one last time, calm, timeless, echoing through the ages, know thyself. And with those words, the silence becomes sacred once more. Night has fallen over the mountain. The wind drifts through the olive groves, brushing the old paths where pilgrims once walked. The stars, cold and patient, hang above Parnassus like forgotten lanterns, and somewhere in that vast quiet, Delphi still dreams. It dreams of footsteps, the soft tread of those who climbed its slopes, hearts heavy with questions. It dreams of the spring that once shimmered in the moonlight, and of the voices that rose in reverent awe before the god who never showed his face. Though centuries have passed, though empires have come and gone, the mountain remembers every sound. It remembers the breath of the oracle, the trembling air that carried the will of Apollo. Yet now the temple lies open to the sky. Its columns, half buried in moss and time, reach upward as if still yearning for the divine. Birds nest where gold once gleamed, and the marble is warm with sunlight again. The gods have withdrawn, but what they left behind is not emptiness, it is peace. The kind that comes when mystery is no longer feared, but embraced. Delphi was never just a place. It was a question given shape in stone. What is truth? What is destiny? Can we ever truly know? The answers, perhaps, were never meant to be spoken. They were meant to be felt, in the tremor of the earth beneath the temple, in the rush of wind through the cedars, in the stillness that comes when one finally stops asking and simply listens. That listening is prophecy's true inheritance. It lives on in the way we look at the stars and wonder what they mean. It lingers in the hush between two thoughts, where intuition hums softly like a secret flame. We no longer climb sacred mountains, but we still seek, we still listen. And sometimes, if the night is quiet enough, something ancient stirs within, a memory, a knowing, a voice without words. Perhaps the oracle never vanished at all. Perhaps she lives wherever a soul pauses in awe, wherever a question is asked with humility, wherever silence is treated not as absence, but as presence. For the divine has never stopped speaking. It has only changed the language of its voice. The pilgrims of the modern world carry no offerings of gold or laurel. They bring instead their curiosity, their sorrow, their hope. They travel not to temples, but to the landscapes of their own hearts. And in that sacred space within, Delphi awakens again, not as a ruin, but as a remembrance that meaning is always near, waiting to be heard. The oracle's final whisper was never a prophecy, but a gift, the reminder that knowledge is not only found in revelation, but in reflection. That truth is not distant, but mirrored in the quiet of our own being, that to know thyself is to know the world, for all things are bound in the same breath of creation. So let the mountains sleep. Let the laurel trees sway once more in the wind, their leaves murmuring stories to the night. Let the stones rest, and the echoes fade gently into time. For in every ending there is a beginning that waits, unseen, eternal. And when you close your eyes tonight, may you hear, faint but clear, that ancient whisper moving through the dark. A voice older than gods, older than memory, calling you softly home to yourself. The oracle is silent. The seeker rests, but the question and the wonder live on.